Marcus's breath came in shallow gasps, the cold wind biting through his worn jacket as he pedaled down the street. He'd been doing this for years now, riding the streets, making deliveries. It wasn't glamorous, and it sure as hell wasn't easy. But it was work. It was honest. It had started with the little things, the looks, the muttered insults, the doors that slammed in his face before he even had the chance to ask for a signature. There was one house in particular that stood out in his mind. It was a big place with a shiny, expensive car parked out front. Today, it was no different. He arrived at the doorstep, his bike tires squealing against the wet pavement as he came to a stop. "You again?" The words were thick with disdain, his lips barely moving. Marcus nodded, holding up the package. "Delivery for Mr. Thompson." His voice was steady, though the sting of the man's tone cut deeper than the cold ever could. The door didn't open any further. The man didn't even look at the package. Instead, he stared at Marcus like he was a nuisance, like he didn't belong there. "I'm not signing for that," the man said, his voice dismissive. "Leave it at the curb." Marcus's heart dropped into his stomach, the familiar sting of rejection surging through him. He'd been told this too many times, been ignored or treated as invisible. "I can't leave it there," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm, his chest tightening with frustration. "It's not safe. I have to get a signature." The door slammed in his face. Marcus stood there, staring at the wood for a long moment. His mind raced, but no one seemed to see him that way. With a slow exhale, he turned away, wheeling his bike down the steps. The cold wind hit him again, sharper this time, like the world itself was mocking him. He'd done his best, but it was never enough. As Marcus rode down the wet streets, the rain began to fall heavier, the steady rhythm of it slapping against the... He wished for something more, something beyond this. He wished someone would see him, really see him. Just as he turned a corner, he felt something shift inside him. He shook his head. "Get it together, Marcus," he muttered under his breath, though the warmth spreading through him didn't fade. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the faint sound of a voice. But when he looked around, the street was empty. The day dragged on as Marcus made his way through the city. The bike was starting to feel heavier with each stop. He'd been to a dozen houses by now, same story every time. A few doors opened, and a handful of signatures were thrown at him like crumbs. He had learned not to let it bother him, not to let the cold glances, the muttered comments, the sneers of disbelief sink in. But today felt different. "So you again," the man had said like he was an annoyance. And Marcus was so damn tired of being just that, an annoyance, a nameless, faceless worker, invisible. As he pedaled through the wet streets, he found himself thinking about his grandmother, about the story. It had always been hard to believe those stories. The next stop was another wealthy neighborhood, with homes that looked like they had been plucked from the pages of a magazine. The door swung open, and a woman stood there, her eyes immediately scanning him from head to toe, sizing him up. "Delivery for Ms. Parker," Marcus said, holding up the package. His voice was firm, but he could feel the uncertainty growing in his chest. Was she going to reject him too? Her eyes flickered down to the package, and she didn't even bother to look at his face. "I don't need it right now," she said, her voice cold. "Just leave it on the porch." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to remind her that it wasn't safe to leave it there, but the words stuck in his throat. There was no use in trying. She had already made up her mind. With a heavy sigh, he placed the package carefully on the porch, careful not to drop it. He felt it then, the anger bubbling up inside him, hot and raw. It was the kind of anger that came from years of being looked down on, of being treated like he wasn't even human. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he walked back to his bike. But just as he was about to mount it, he froze. A voice, soft and clear, whispered through the air, as if coming from within him. "Do not let this steal your peace." Marcus's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing as if he had heard a voice that wasn't his own. He looked around, but the street was empty. No one was there. Yet the words echoed in his mind, steady and calm. "Do not let this steal your peace." For a moment, time seemed to stop. He didn't know where the voice had come from, but in that quiet space, something shifted inside him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from a quiet mind or an easy day. It was something deeper. It wasn't about the people who slammed doors in his face. Marcus took a slow breath and stood taller, the weight of his anger still there, but now tempered with something else, something he couldn't explain. Not yet. Not ever. The sky grew darker as Marcus rode through the city, his thoughts still swirling around the strange, comforting voice he'd heard earlier. Do not let this steal your peace. He didn't have the answers, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let the day break him. He'd survived worse before, and today wasn't different. His next delivery was to a small apartment complex tucked between two larger buildings. It wasn't a fancy place, not the kind of neighborhood where people wore designer clothes and carried themselves like they were above the rest. He knocked on the door, his hands cold against the package he held. When the door opened, a young woman stood there, a slight frown on her face, her tired eyes scanning him quickly. "Delivery for Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. She didn't respond immediately, but there was a pause, a strange, almost heavy silence. "Yeah, that's me," she said after a beat, stepping aside to allow him in. "Thanks." Marcus stepped inside, the warmth of the apartment immediately hitting him, and for a moment he thought about how little H. But there was something about the way this woman looked at him that felt different, something that made him pause. "I don't usually get deliveries," she said, her voice softer now. "Not like this. You're one of the first." He nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to having with people he delivered to. "Thank you," she added, her gaze steady. "I know it's not easy doing what you do. I don't think people understand. But it's important. What you do." For a moment Marcus stood there, stunned. The words caught him off guard. It wasn't just a polite exchange. It felt real. "No one ever says that," he replied quietly, his voice betraying a trace of vulnerability. "Not to me." The woman paused, her expression softening before she glanced out the window to the street. "I see you out here sometimes. You work hard. You don't have to be invisible." His heart gave a sharp pang at the words, at the unexpected kindness that he had longed for but never really received. "I appreciate that," Marcus said, his voice almost breaking. "I don't get much recognition." She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I think a lot of us feel that way, you know. But don't forget, you matter." Marcus stood there for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Her words hung in the air, offering something he hadn't realized he needed: acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was everything. "Thank you," he said again, his voice small but filled with something else, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He turned and walked back to the door, his bike waiting for him outside. As he stepped out into the cool air, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. Just a little. As he mounted his bike and began to pedal away, Marcus looked up at the sky, the storm clouds parting just enough to let the faintest gly. And that, in itself, was enough. Marcus was nearing the end of his shift. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city streets. But the streets had a way of throwing curveballs when he least expected them. His next stop was at an upscale downtown apartment complex. There was something about the place that felt cold, detached, like it didn't belong to people who had ever struggled. He locked his bike to the nearest post and walked up to the intercom. "Yeah?" The voice was sharp, curt, not unkind, but distant. "Delivery for Ms. Harris," Marcus said, the words sliding out of his mouth with practiced ease. There was a brief pause before the voice returned, laced with a tinge of surprise. "You're the one on the bike, right?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, holding up the package. "You can come up." The door buzzed, and Marcus stepped inside, climbing the stairs to the penthouse floor. When he reached the door of Miss "Hi," she said, looking him over with mild curiosity. "Just leave it here." Her eyes skimmed over the package without a second glance, and she stepped aside as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. Marcus hesitated. He could feel his body tense, the familiar sting of rejection rising in him again. "Ma'am," he started, his voice soft but firm, "could I get a signature, please?" She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she picked up her phone, her fingers tapping out a quick message. "I just leave it, I don't need to sign for it." Marcus's chest tightened. He could feel the familiar anger beginning to surface, but he held it in. He had learned to swallow his pride when people treated him like this. It was easier that way. But just as he turned to leave, something shifted inside him. He didn't know what it was, but the feeling was unmistakable. A small, persistent push from somewhere deep within. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice quieter now. "I've been working all day." The words felt strange as they left his mouth. He wasn't sure where the courage to say them had come from. There was silence, and then she sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "Fine," she said, walking over to a small table and signing the form. As she handed it to him, there was an odd shift in the air, a moment of quiet understanding between them. "Thank you," he said quietly, nodding at her. She didn't respond, but Marcus didn't mind. He didn't need her to. For the first time today, he felt like he had stood up for himself, even in a small way, and that felt like a small victory. As he walked back to the door, he heard a voice in his mind again, clear and strong. "Do not let this steal your peace." This time, he didn't feel the confusion or doubt that had plagued him earlier. This time he knew. He was a person, and that mattered. Stepping back into the cool night air, Marcus felt something in him shift. He didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid. The night air had turned sharp, biting at Marcus's skin as he rode through the dimly lit streets. His legs were tired, his back aching from hours of pedaling, but his mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Ms. Butt that piece was fleeting. As he approached his next stop, a small, run-down apartment building in an area he knew all too well, the weight of the world seemed to come rushing back. His bike squeaked as he brought it to a halt in front of the building. The rain had started up again, the sound of it tapping against the pavement like an endless drumbeat. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, the walls covered in yellowing posters and outdated flyers. A woman no older than 40 stood in the doorway. "Delivery for Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice quiet, tired. The woman hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe, as if she wasn't sure whether to let him in. "You've been delivering here all day, huh?" she asked, her voice low but not unkind. He nodded, not really sure how to respond. It was a question he had heard before, but this time it felt different. "I have," Marcus said, glancing down at the package. "And sometimes it feels like I'm invisible, like I don't matter to anyone." She nodded slowly, her eyes softening as she stepped back to let him in. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he stepped inside. As the woman signed for the package, Marcus couldn't help but think of how differently people like her lived, compared to those in the fancy downtown apartments. "Thank you," she said, handing the receipt back to him. Her smile was small, but genuine. "For doing what you do, I know it's not easy." Marcus didn't know how to respond at first. "I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, her expression understanding. "Yeah, but some people don't even do that with dignity. You do, you don't give up." He stood there for a moment, trying to process her words. The weight of them hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You don't know how much that means." As he turned to leave, something shifted in him. It wasn't just about the packages anymore, or the deliveries. It wasn't about getting the signatures or completing the routes. When he stepped back into the hallway, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sound of it muffled by the walls of the B. And then, as if it was meant to be, he heard the voice again. Clear, steady. "Do not let this steal your peace." Marcus froze in his tracks, the words washing over him like a balm. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't just a delivery man, and no matter how hard the world tried to break him, he had a strength inside him that could carry him through. With renewed resolve, Marcus climbed back onto his bike and pedaled away, the rain now nothing more than a faint memory. And he wasn't going to let anything take it away. The days blurred together for Marcus, one delivery after another, the rhythm of his work no longer a steady beat, but a pulse that seemed to carry him through life like an invisible force. But as the days passed, the weight didn't lighten much. The cycle continued, the tiredness, the cold, the slammed doors. Yet somehow he held on. This day started like every other, the familiar creak of his bike's pedals, the smell of rain against asphalt, the cool touch of air on his face. His next stop was in a neighborhood he hadn't been to in a while, an old weathered block that looked like it was barely holding itself together. He parked his bike near a rundown storefront, the flickering neon sign in the window casting a dim light on the cracked sidewalk. A moment later, the door cracked open. A woman stood there, her face drawn and tired, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Marcus pause. "You have a package for me?" Her voice was raspy, worn. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, holding out the package. "Delivery for Ms. Turner." She stepped back, motioning for him to come in, but as he entered the apartment, he noticed the heavy silence in the air. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice low, almost distant, as she signed the receipt. Marcus nodded, trying to keep the awkwardness at bay, but there was a tension here he couldn't ignore, but she seemed different. "I know you don't know me," she said suddenly, breaking the silence, "but I see you out there, on that bike, day after day." Her words took him by surprise. He hadn't expected this, didn't know what to say. "People don't see you," she continued, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "But I do. I see you." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He had learned to hold his tongue, to pretend that the sting of being overlooked didn't hurt. But today it was different. "I've been there," she said, her voice steady now. "I know what it's like to feel invisible." Marcus stood there, looking at her. She didn't seem like the kind of person who had it easy, not by a long shot. "I don't know how to make it stop," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "I don't know how to make people see me, or anyone like me." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so worn down. For a moment, the weight of her words hung in the air, filling the space between them. Marcus felt a stirring in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "I can't stop," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how." She smiled faintly, her eyes soft but strong. "I know you can't. And I know that no matter what, you won't. Because you're already more than what they think." Marcus stood there for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't giving him pity. As he left her apartment, the rain had stopped, and the city felt a little quieter, a little less harsh. Marcus climbed back onto his bike, the tires squealing against the wet pavement. For the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't riding to escape. He was riding to fight. The wind picked up as Marcus rode down the street, his bike tires skimming across the slick pavement. The sky, which had been clear only a few minutes before, was now shrouded in dark clouds, swirling ominously overhead. The city, still wet from the earlier rain, felt heavy with the promise of another downpour. He had never been one for hope, at least not in any tangible sense. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, like she knew something he didn't, but he couldn't shake it. His next stop was just a few blocks away, another delivery to a woman he didn't know. He knocked on the door, waiting for the inevitable response. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and a moment later, the door creaked open. "Delivery for Mrs. Lewis," Marcus said, holding the package up. "Thank you," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. There was a moment of hesitation in her eyes, but she didn't say anything as he entered. "I didn't expect a delivery today," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared." Marcus shook his head. "It's all right. I'm used to it." He handed her the package and she signed for it, but before he could turn to leave, she spoke again. "You've been working all day, haven't you?" she asked. "I can see it in your face. The weight of it. People don't realize how hard it is, how much of yourself you give when you're out there." Marcus stiffened. She was right. He was tired. "Yeah, it's a long day," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But it's what I do." It's what I have to do. She nodded, her eyes softening with empathy. You know, I used to feel like that too, she said, walking toward the small kitchen. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by her words. You don't know how much that means, he said, his voice thick. The words felt heavy, like he was saying something he had held in for far too long. Mrs. Lewis gave him a small, tired smile. I do know. I know because I've been where you are, and I know how hard it is to feel like you're just a part of the background. But you're not. You matter. Marcus stood there, frozen for a moment. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled with the unexpected kindness she had shown him. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. You keep going, you keep showing up. Her words lingered in the air long after he left her apartment. He mounted his bike and began to pedal through the streets, the weight of the world still there, but not quite as heavy as before. As he rode through the streets, the storm began to clear. Marcus kept riding, his heart just a little lighter than before. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time he believed he could face it. The days continued to stretch on, one delivery after another, the rhythm of Marcus's life locked in a cycle that he couldn't seem to escape. The world around him buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, indifferent to his existence. But the flame was fragile, and it didn't take much to blow it out. That morning, as Marcus prepared for his route, his mind was clouded with the usual worries. More packages to deliver, more faces that wouldn't see him, more people who wouldn't care. The city seemed darker than usual as he rode through the streets. His first stop was a small apartment building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Thank you for bringing it, she said, her voice steady but warm. It's good to see someone who still does their job with respect. Marcus nodded, surprised by her words. Most people didn't speak to him like that, not with kindness or recognition. I'm just doing my job, he said quietly, stepping back to leave. But she stopped him before he could walk away. Don't ever forget, she said softly, that what you do matters. People like you keep the world running. You may not hear it often, but you're important. Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment he was speechless. The rest of the day passed in a blur, delivery after delivery, door after door, the usual indifference, the hurried refusals, the unacknowledged packages. But when he reached his final stop of the day, everything changed. The house was large, tucked behind a tall iron gate, the kind of place that made Marcus feel like he didn't belong. He rang the doorbell, waiting for someone to answer, but when the door swung open, it wasn't a person who greeted him. It was a figure, a tall man, dressed in simple clothes, his hair dark and his eyes full of quiet wisdom. Are you Marcus? The man asked, his voice soft yet certain. Marcus blinked, taken aback. Yeah, I am. How do you know my name? The man smiled gently. I've been waiting for you. Marcus felt a strange shiver run down his spine. He didn't know how to respond. Come inside, the man said, stepping aside to let Marcus in. You've been carrying a heavy burden for a long time, and I think it's time you let it go. Marcus didn't know why, but he followed the man into the house. The man led him to a small room at the back of the house, where the faintest hint of incense hung in the air. There was a chair placed near a window, and the man gestured for Marcus to sit. Tell me, Marcus, the man said, his eyes locking onto his, what is it that weighs on you? Marcus's throat tightened. No one had ever asked him that before, not in this way, not like they truly cared. I don't know, Marcus said finally, his voice low. It feels like I've been invisible my whole life. The man nodded, his gaze steady. I see you. You're not invisible. And you're not alone. Marcus's heart raced at the words. He had heard them before, of course. But this time they felt different. They felt like a truth that reached deep into his bones. I don't know how to keep going, Marcus whispered. The man smiled softly, a gentle warmth spreading through the room. You don't have to do it alone. For the first time, Marcus felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. It wasn't the world that was changing. It was him. The man stepped back toward the door, his presence still filling the room. As he left, Marcus stood there for a long time, the weight of the man's words settling deep inside him, and as he left the house, the sky had finally cleared. The streets were calm, the rain gone. The city felt different now, brighter somehow. Marcus took a deep breath and mounted his bike, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed felt strangely lighter. The burden Marcus had carried for so long seemed to be lessened, not by any grand gesture or miracle, but by a quiet understanding. As he rode through the streets, the world around him still seemed as indifferent as it ever had been. People hurried by, rushing to their destinations, their faces locked in expressions of purpose or exhaustion. Today, his route was familiar: apartment complexes, houses with pristine lawns, the usual mix of indifference and brief interactions. His next stop was a small, unremarkable house on the edge of town. "Delivery for Miss Carter," Marcus said, holding up the package. The woman looked him over, her eyes softening as she took in his tired expression. "Thank you," she said, her voice kind. "It's been a long day for you, huh?" He nodded, surprised by her empathy. Most people didn't care about his long days, but there was something in her eyes that said she understood. "I've been there," she added, stepping back to allow him inside. "I know how hard you work. People don't get it." Her words weren't grand or dramatic, but they settled deep in his chest, like a warm, gentle balm for a wound he hadn't even realized was there. "I just keep doing it," Marcus replied, his voice quiet. "I don't know any other way." She smiled softly, her expression gentle. Sometimes just doing it is enough. Marcus handed her the package, and as she signed for it, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something inside him, something like gratitude, something like peace. "You've made my day easier," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you." As he left her home, something shifted in the air. The next few stops were more of the same: the cold doors, the impersonal handoffs, the occasional smile from someone who saw more than just the delivery. When he reached his final stop of the day, the sky had darkened, the city lights flickering on as he rolled down the street. This was the kind of neighborhood where people lived behind high walls, where the lawns were neatly manicured and the cars were always the latest model. He rang the doorbell, his heart beating a little faster than it had been earlier, as if something was coming, something. "Delivery for Mr. Walker," Marcus said, holding the package in his hands. The man looked at him, his eyes cold and appraising. "Just leave it at the door," he said, his voice clipped, dismissive. Marcus stood there for a moment, the words that had become all too familiar. "Just leave it. Don't need to sign for it." "Sir," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm just doing my job. I can't leave it without a signature." The man's gaze hardened. "I don't have time for this. Just leave it." Marcus didn't move. He held the package a little higher, his stance unwavering. "I understand you're busy," Marcus said, "but my job is to get a signature. If you want the package, I need that." The man looked at him for a moment, something shifting in his eyes. For a moment there was a flicker, something like surprise, maybe even admiration, though it was quickly masked by his indifference. "I don't have time for this," he repeated, turning away. But Marcus stood his ground. "It only takes a second." There was a long pause, the silence hanging between them, broken only by the faint sound of rain falling against the pavement. "Here," he said, his voice less sharp now, but still distant. Marcus took the receipt, nodding silently. "Thank you, sir." He turned and left the house, his heart still pounding, but now with a quiet sense of pride. As he rode away, the rain had started to fall harder, the city streets now glowing with reflections of neon signs and streetlights. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. The rain fell steadily through the night, a constant hum against the pavement as Marcus pedaled down the familiar streets. He was tired, his legs sore from the constant motion, the weariness of the day settling deep in his bones. But something had changed in him. The city around him felt like a world that moved in a blur, a machine with gears that turned endlessly without regard for the people who powered it. His last stop was a small apartment complex in an area he hadn't visited in a while. The building was tucked away in a quieter part of town, one that had seen better days, but still held a sense of familiarity. When he knocked, He heard movement from inside. The door opened slowly and a woman stood in the doorway. "Delivery for Ms. Green," Marcus said, holding up the package. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was small, cozy, despite its worn-down appearance. "I wasn't expecting anything," she said, her voice gentle, "but I'm glad you're here. Thank you for bringing it." Marcus handed her the package, and as she signed for it, he could feel the weight of the day slowly lifting off his shoulders. "Thank you for doing your job," she said, her voice steady. "I know it's not easy. People like you, who work day in and day out, who don't get enough credit, they matter." The words hung in the air between them, settling deep inside him. "It's just what I do," Marcus replied, his voice quieter than usual. She smiled, her eyes softening. "Still," she said, "thank you. People like you keep the world running, even if no one notices." For a long moment, Marcus stood there, unsure of how to respond. But the truth was he didn't need to. Her words had already done their work. As he left her apartment, the rain had stopped completely, the streets now quiet and calm. He walked back to his bike, the weight of the day still there but not as heavy. He wasn't invisible anymore. As he rode through the city, the night air felt cooler on his face, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the stirring. And no matter how heavy the load, he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The next few days passed quietly, like a steady current under the surface of Marcus's life. The world hadn't changed drastically, but he had. It was a strange feeling, this quiet peace. He had never been one to hold on to it for too long. Life, as he knew it, had always been about the struggle, the fight, the constant push forward. But for once, the fight didn't feel quite so heavy. His bike creaked under the weight of the deliveries, but it was a familiar sound now, one that didn't weigh on him as much. This morning he had a new route, a different set of deliveries to make. His first stop was to an apartment complex in a neighborhood that felt a little more familiar. Gritty, working class, the kind of place that felt like home. But today, it didn't feel like it would matter. The door to the apartment opened after a moment, and a young man, probably in his late 20s, looked up at Marcus. "Delivery for Mr. Foster," Marcus said, holding out the package. The man took a moment before responding. Just leave it here." Marcus stood his ground, his voice steady. "I can't leave it without a signature." For a brief moment the man stared at him, his gaze flickering between the package and Marcus's unwavering stance. Then with a sigh, he stepped aside. "Fine," he muttered, moving toward the counter and signing the form before handing it back. "Thanks." It was a small victory, but it was one that felt different. The man didn't look at Marcus with disdain, didn't dismiss him like so many others had. As he left the building, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. The next few deliveries were much the same, small, unremarkable exchanges, a signature here, a brief interaction there. Some people took a moment to acknowledge him, others didn't. His final stop of the day took him to a part of the city he hadn't been in for a while. The apartment complex was old, the building showing signs of wear and neglect. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the hallway, and after a moment the door swung open. "Delivery for Ms. Harper," Marcus said, holding up the package. The woman's face softened as she looked at him, and for a brief moment their eyes met, and Marcus saw something he hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but filled with warmth. "I know it's not easy out there. People don't get how hard you work. But I see you." For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the sting of emotion rise in his chest, threatening to break through. "It's nothing," he said, his voice thick, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just doing my job." She smiled softly, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Doing your job, yes. But it matters. You matter." For a long moment, Marcus stood there, unable to speak. It wasn't just the words that caught him off guard. It was the sincerity in her voice, the recognition of his humanity, of his worth. "Thank you," he finally managed to say, his voice quieter now. "You don't know what that means." She nodded, and with a final smile, she closed the door. As Marcus turned to leave, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The world around him hadn't changed. Riding through the streets, the sky now clearing as the rain faded into a soft mist, Marcus felt the weight of the world still on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he was beginning to believe it. The next morning arrived with a heavy fog that hung over the city like a blanket, dulling the sharp edges of the world around Marcus. As he prepared for another day of deliveries, he found himself in a strange state of quiet reflection. He locked up his bike and adjusted the packages in his basket. The day ahead would be full of the usual grind. The indifferent stares, the quick exchanges, the doors that didn't open unless he pushed. His first stop took him to a building he had been to before, a large, faceless structure on the edge of a busy commercial district. He made his way to the elevator, his boots clicking on the marble floor as he waited for the doors to close. He knocked. It was the same as always. The sound of footsteps behind the door, a pause, then the door creaking open. "Just leave it," the man said, holding out a hand as if the package were just another mundane thing, something he could toss aside with no care. Marcus hesitated for a moment, feeling the familiar ache rise in his chest. He had been through this routine too many times to count. "I need a signature," he said, his voice steady. The man stared at him for a long moment, his face darkening. "Are you serious?" he asked, as if Marcus had just asked for something absurd. "Yes," Marcus replied, his tone not backing down. "I'm serious. I'm just doing my job. All I need is your signature." There was a long silence, the man's irritation palpable. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned. He took the pen, signed the receipt without another word, and handed it back. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice quieter but firm, as he turned and walked back to the elevator. As he stepped into the elevator, he looked up at the mirror on the wall, catching his reflection for a moment. The world may have seen him as just another delivery worker, just another cog in the machine. The next several deliveries passed by in a blur, one apartment after another, one cold glance after another. But Marcus didn't mind so much anymore. His final delivery of the day was to a small house on the edge of a neighborhood he didn't frequent often. A woman stood there, no more than 50, her hair streaked with gray but still full of life. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes immediately softening. "Delivery for Ms. Foster," Marcus said, holding up the package. "Ah, thank you," she said, stepping aside to let him in. She was warm, welcoming, not in a rushed or dismissive way, but with an openness that felt genuine. The moment felt real, not transactional. As she signed for the package, she paused, looking up at him. "You've been out there working all day, haven't you?" she asked, her voice quiet, empathetic. Marcus nodded, unsure of what to say. "You know," she said softly, "it's easy to feel like no one notices. People forget about the work you do. Forget that you're a person too, but I see you and I appreciate what you do." The words settled over him, like a quiet warmth he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You don't know what that means." She smiled, and for a moment everything felt right. As he left her home, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it felt like a new beginning. The world might not always see him, but he saw himself. And that was enough. The days bled into one another, each one starting and ending with the same cycle: deliveries, signatures, cold looks, brief exchanges. But something had shifted inside Marcus. The world around him hadn't changed much, but he had learned to carry it differently. Today the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting a dull grey light across the streets. The air was cool, crisp, with the promise of more rain. He didn't mind the rain anymore. His first stop of the day was to a small, modest apartment complex, the kind of place where people lived with purpose, but not much else. It wasn't fancy, but it was home for the people who lived there. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. A moment later it opened, and a woman in her late 30s stood there, her eyes wary but kind. "Delivery for Mrs. Sanchez," Marcus said, holding up the package. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in, and he followed her into the small, dimly lit apartment. "Thank you," she said, signing for the package. "I know you must be tired, doing this every day." Marcus shrugged, the familiar exhaustion weighing on him. "It's just part of the job." She paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on him in a way that felt different from the usual indifference he encountered. For a brief moment, Marcus felt something stir inside him. He had heard similar words before, but it was different this time. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "That really means something." She smiled faintly, a warmth in her eyes that made Marcus feel something he hadn't in a long time, seen. Not just as a man doing a job, but as someone who mattered, who was worthy of respect. He left her apartment, his mind still processing the exchange. It wasn't much, but it was something he had needed to hear. The day continued much like it always did, delivery after delivery, package after package, but the world didn't feel as heavy as it had before. His last stop of the day was to a familiar neighborhood. As he arrived at the house, he could already feel the familiar weight of the rejection coming. He rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door opened. "Leave it at the door," the man said, his voice curt, almost bored. But today, Marcus didn't move. He stood his ground, his voice firm. "I need a signature, sir." The man stared at him for a moment, his brow furrowing in irritation. "I told you, leave it. I don't have time for this." Marcus took a deep breath. "I understand, but I still need a signature." For a long moment the man glared at him, clearly irritated by the simple request. But Marcus didn't flinch. "Fine, here," he muttered, signing the receipt before shoving it back at Marcus. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. Riding away from the house, the evening air cool against his skin, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. The road ahead was long, and he still had many battles to face. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel alone in the fight. The world hadn't changed, but he had, and that was enough. It had been a long week. The rain had come and gone, leaving the streets slick and cold as Marcus pedaled through them. The familiar ache in his legs still there, gnawing at him. The fatigue wasn't just physical anymore. The streets were busier than usual, cars honking in frustration as they cut off each other, pedestrians hurriedly crossing intersections, their faces locked in the same determined ind. His first stop of the day was a block of apartment buildings that, in the past, had always felt like a breath of familiarity. It wasn't a wealthy area, but it wasn't a poor one either. But today, as Marcus approached one of the buildings, he felt an unease that he couldn't shake. A moment later, the door opened, but the person on the other side didn't even look at him. "Excuse me, I need a signature," Marcus said, his voice steady but worn. The person looked up at him briefly, their eyes distant, dismissive. "Just leave it," they muttered, taking the package from his hand without another word. Marcus hesitated. He had asked for a signature. This was part of the job. It wasn't much to ask. "I need the signature," Marcus repeated, his voice harder now. The door cracked open again, just a sliver.